Hi, Modern World History students. Welcome to Unit 6, the First World War, one of the most popular units of the entire school year. Before we begin, I want to show you something unusual about the First World War and the countries that fought in it and the leaders who led those countries. The story begins with Queen Victoria. You might remember Queen Victoria of Great Britain. We discussed her in the last unit a little bit. You notice that she ruled Britain from 1837 until 1901, a period of 64 years, making her one of the longest reigning British monarchs, one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history. She had actually married her first cousin, which may sound unusual to you, but it wasn't that uncommon in royal families back then. His name was Albert, Prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And that may sound a little German to you. Well, Queen Victoria's family traced its lineage back to Germany. Her ancestors were ethnically German. Regardless, they produced a son who was Edward VII, King of Great Britain, from 1901 until 1910. So after Victoria died, their son Edward took over. He ruled Britain for 9 years. You say, okay, that's not very long. That's what happens, though, when your mother lives so long, okay? Edward, meanwhile, had married Alexandra, a Danish princess, and they had produced a son who became King George V. And George V ruled Britain from 1910 until 1936. He was the King of Great Britain during the First World War, and he was Queen Victoria's grandson. All right, well, his aunt, however, Aunt Victoria, who was Victoria and Albert's daughter, had married the Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Germany, who at that time was Frederick III. Now, Frederick did not last long as Kaiser of Germany. As a matter of fact, he ruled Germany for less than 1 year before he died. And it was their son, Wilhelm II, who was then Kaiser of Germany from 1888 until 1918. That's a typo. 1888 until 1918. So he ruled Germany for 30 years, and that made him the Kaiser of Germany during World War I. So what may surprise you is that during World War I, the Kaiser of Germany led his state into war against Great Britain. At the time, the King of Great Britain was his first cousin. Now, what's interesting here also in the meantime is that this Princess Alexandra of Denmark, mother of the British King George V, her sister Marie had married Alexander III, Tsar of Russia. They had produced a son named Nicholas, and in 1894, Nicholas became Tsar of Russia. He ruled Russia for just about 23 years, from 1894 until 1917. So he was the Tsar of Russia during World War I. So the Tsar of Russia was the first cousin to the King of Great Britain during World War I, and the King of Great Britain was the first cousin to the Kaiser of Germany during World War I. These two were on the same side during the war, fighting against him. So it was a very, very strange war, as it was a war that not only pitted nations against each other, but even tore apart a family in a way. So let's talk about how that happened. And what's interesting is the event that triggered the war the event that ultimately triggered the war had nothing to do with either of these three men. So let's see how that could be possible. So this is our section number 1, which focuses on the causes of the First World War. I hope that by the time we're done, you'll be able to explain to what extent alliances contributed to the outbreak of the war. I'd like you to be able to explain why nationalism was so intense among a group of people called the Bosnian Serbs, and how this intense nationalism led to the event that triggered the outbreak of the war. And then finally, I'd like you to be able to explain why Russia supported Serbia and the Bosnian Serbs in this conflict that contributed to the outbreak of the war. These first few items to know are tied in with the first concept to explain. The next 4 items to know are tied in with the second item to explain. And then these last 2, Pan-Slavism and Tsar Nicholas II, which is partially covered up right now, is tied in with the third item to explain. So we'll hear about all of these in today's lesson. So let's start with this question of alliances. Well, the fact is there was a pretty significant alliance system in Europe as the First World War began, or in the years prior to the First World War. You might remember Otto von Bismarck. Can't forget Otto von Bismarck, the man who had built the German state. He was the Chancellor of Prussia who had used Prussian power to either fight wars or intimidate princes, and by doing so brought Germany together into a powerful, single, united state, an empire, a Reich, led by a Kaiser. That was Otto von Bismarck's doing. But you might also remember that having fought wars in order to build the German state, Bismarck then became sort of the chief peacemaker in Europe, because he recognized that Germany, which was sort of right in the middle of Europe and wedged in between three pretty powerful countries, France to the west, Austria-Hungary to the south, Russia to the east. If a general European war broke out, a war that would engulf the entire continent, Germany could very well be torn apart. And so once Germany was created, Bismarck worked tirelessly to ensure that no future war was fought. He admitted, though, that if a war was fought in the future, Germany's most likely enemy in that war would be France. After all, the last war that he had fought, the Franco-Prussian War, saw the Prussians, that is the Germans, humiliate the French, provoke them into a war that they weren't ready to fight, but which Prussia very much was, and then humiliate their armies and take from them an area called Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine, a portion of land in which the population is roughly half French and half German. So that was sheared off from France as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, and it became part of Germany. Bismarck knew that France, therefore, was like an intractable enemy of Germany. France would be determined to have revenge and take back Alsace-Lorraine, and there was really nothing Germany could do to make a friend out of France. So instead, Bismarck wanted to gain some insurance for Germany in the event of war with France. So he formed an alliance that became known as the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance included Austria-Hungary and Italy. Italy was a country that had worked with Bismarck before. As a matter of fact, it was Italy and Bismarck's Prussia which had teamed up to defeat Austria in a war called the 7 Weeks' War. They had essentially tricked Austria-Hungary into fighting a two-front war, which had forced Austria, it had forced Austria, what wasn't yet called Austria-Hungary, to divide its forces in two, sending half their army north to fight the Prussians, the other half sort of south and west to fight the Italians, and then both halves had been destroyed relatively easily. Well, so Germany had a sort of existing relationship with Italy. Obviously, both of them had a bad relationship with Austria-Hungary, having gone to war with them. But now, with conditions changing, with Austria-Hungary facing some problems elsewhere, the threat of Russia looming to the east, for example, and also the fact that the ruling family of Austria-Hungary were ethnically German. And so it was easy for Otto von Bismarck to make a case that Germans, in the end, ought to stick together now that their war was over. Austria-Hungary joined Germany. And so the Triple Alliance was formed. It consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This provided Germany some protection, so that in the event of war with France, a war which the Germans would have to fight here, to the west of Germany, they at least wouldn't have to deal with a two-front war coming out of the south. France would not be able to recruit Austria-Hungary into a war with Germany and force the Germans to fight a two-front war. Italy, meanwhile, would threaten France with having to fight a two-front war in the event of war with Germany. So this was an alliance that put Otto von Bismarck's mind at ease. He felt that he could avoid war in Europe, but in the event that he was unable to avoid a war with France, at least Germany was secured against fighting a two-front war here, and he had gained a more permanent ally to help force France to fight a two-front war here. Now, if Bismarck had had his way, he would have eventually formed an additional alliance between Germany and the United Kingdom, or Britain. That would have pretty much boxed in France in every possible way, because Britain's strong navy would then be added to this alliance. And as a matter of fact, Otto von Bismarck was working on building that alliance with the United Kingdom when he lost his job. How did he lose his job? Well, Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had been sort of Bismarck's chief supporter, because Bismarck had built up this German state on his behalf, Kaiser Wilhelm I died. And then his son, Kaiser Frederick III, as you saw, lasted only less than a year before dying. Wilhelm I's not immediate successor, but then the successor of his successor, the successor of Frederick III, was Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II was a younger man, very ambitious. He didn't like Otto von Bismarck's policies. He didn't like the fact that Otto von Bismarck was always trying to make peace, because he was one of these people who believed that countries demonstrated their strength, and as a matter of fact, became stronger through war. He didn't like the fact that Otto von Bismarck had not tried to claim more colonies for Germany in Africa. You remember that during the Berlin Conference, which was Bismarck's conference, he had allowed France and Britain to take most of Africa and had taken only small portions for Germany. Wilhelm felt that that was a mistake as well. He felt that these things deprived Germany of opportunities to demonstrate how strong, how powerful Germany was. And so, when he became Kaiser, very shortly afterward, he fired Otto von Bismarck. By that time, Bismarck had been the Chancellor of Germany for really about more than 20 years. He had been the Chancellor of Prussia before that. He had built the German state. He had served the German state very capably as Chancellor. But Kaiser Wilhelm II did not agree with his peacemaking approach to things, and so he fired Bismarck and basically took control of Germany's foreign policy himself. Well, the first thing that Kaiser Wilhelm II did was begin the process of building up Germany's navy. If Germany was to be taken seriously as a world power, he felt, and he was probably right, Germany had to have a stronger navy. If Germany was going to build an empire overseas, Germany had to have a strong navy. A navy strong enough even to challenge that of the British Navy. And by this time, the British had had the strongest navy in the world for centuries. So he began building up Germany's navy. This alarmed the British. This alarmed the British. It made them regard Germany not as a potential ally, but as a threat. And that opened the door for France. France, which had been despairing of the possibility that the British might join Germany in an alliance, now jumped at the opportunity. Now that the United Kingdom, now that the British saw the Germans as a threat, jumped at the opportunity to form an alliance with the British, as well as with Russia. And they formed an alliance called the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente. Entente is essentially a French word for an agreement, or if you like, an alliance. So the Triple Entente: France, the United Kingdom or Britain, and Russia. This not only slammed the door shut on any hopes that Germany might form an alliance with the British, but now it boxed Germany in a war. The thing that Bismarck had been desperately trying to avoid, Germany finding itself caught in between two strong powers, in a war, now Germany would be in exactly that position. Because now, in the event of war, France would attack Germany from the west, Russia would attack from the east, and to make matters worse, the British fleet would be committed to fighting the Germans as well. So within just a few years of firing Otto von Bismarck, Kaiser Wilhelm II, through his determination to sort of force Germany's way in as a world power, he had basically created the exact situation that Bismarck had been trying so hard to avoid. So by the time of, let's say, the year 1910, 4 years before the outbreak of World War I, Europe was basically divided into two alliances: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Entente of France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. If you struggle to remember which one is the French one, just remember that Entente is a French word, and you can remember that this way. Entente rhymes with ha ha ha. Entente rhymes with ha ha ha, so it's French. That's the one with France and their allies, the British and the Russians. But alliances weren't the thing that immediately started World War I. The alliances certainly did, however, create a sort of tension in Europe. They created a tension in Europe that a war might break out. I want to bounce back before I go to this next box. They created a fear that war was almost inevitable. No one in Europe wanted this war, but many countries believed that it was certain to happen. And so countries in both alliances then began to build up their weapons. Germany, of course, had led the way. They had started this process out by trying to build up their navy. But now the other countries of Europe also joined in, out of fear that the war would come and they would be unprepared. Again, none of them wanted this war, but almost all of them regarded it as inevitable. And so they began building up their weapons. This is called an arms race. When countries are competing with each other to build up their weapons, it's an arms race. Germany had started it out by launching a naval arms race with the British, and now the rest of the countries joined in as well. And so the alliances and the arms race created a sort of a tension, a sort of a fear that war was certainly coming, was essentially inevitable, even though no one wanted it. But they did not cause the war. War did not happen because of alliances or the arms race. War happened really because of an incident. The war was triggered by an incident in a sort of out of the way place. As far as these countries were concerned, a sort of out of the way place in southeastern Europe. So I'm now taking you to the box in the upper right-hand corner of page 6 to talk about nationalism. Well, you already know about nationalism. You know that nationalism is the feeling that each nation ought to be self-governing. That is, ought not to be governed by foreigners or outsiders. And you remember that the 19th century was a century of nationalism, in which nations led revolts to try to gain independence from the empires that ruled over them, so that they could be independent and self-governing, so that they could be governed by their own kind, by their own nation, and not by someone else, not by foreigners, not by outsiders. Some of these revolts succeeded, others had failed. Well, the particular nationalism that is important to us to tell this story is the nationalism of a group of people called Serbs. So Serbs are a unique nation. They have their own language, they have their own culture, they are a nation. By 1914, most Serbs were satisfied because they lived in a country, a nation state, called Serbia. So most Serbs had they were experiencing the condition of being governed by their own kind. Most Serbs lived in this country called Serbia. Serbia had gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, the empire of the Turks. The Ottoman Empire still existed here. Here's what is today Turkey itself. And then this was what was left in Europe of the Ottoman Empire. Going back into the 1300s, the Ottoman Empire had spread all the way up into southeastern Europe, including Greece and what is today Bulgaria and Romania and Serbia, and even up into parts of Hungary. So all of this had been at one time ruled by the Ottoman Empire, the empire of the Turks. But one by one, parts of it had broken away and become independent. Greece in 1829, and then Serbia as well. And so Serbia now had its own country. The Serbs, the nation of people called the Serbs, had their own country. And so they were happy. And Serbs were being ruled by Serbs. However, some Serbs did not live in Serbia. Here's that big empire called Austria-Hungary. And we showed you how this was a multinational empire. We've talked to you about how 90% of the people who lived in Austria-Hungary were not ethnically German. Even though the family who ruled Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg family, were ethnically German, 90% of their subjects, 90% of the people who they ruled, weren't. Down here, in a region of Austria-Hungary called Bosnia, you had a very large population of Serbs. Over 1 million of them, actually. There were over 1 million Serbs living in Bosnia. And of course, they were very unhappy about it. As Serbs, they wanted to be ruled by other Serbs. They didn't want to be ruled by a German family, didn't want to be ruled by the Habsburgs. And what made it especially frustrating for them was that immediately across the border, there were Serbs being ruled by other Serbs. Immediately across the border, there was a country called Serbia where Serbs were being ruled by Serbs. So what the Bosnian Serbs wanted to do was they wanted to detach Bosnia from Austria-Hungary and attach it to Serbia so that they too could be part of Serbia and be ruled by people of their own nation. The Austrian government said no. The Austrians were not prepared to give up territory like that, valuable territory. But maybe more importantly, what the Austrians feared the most was that if they gave in to the demands of these Bosnian Serbs, all the other nations that their empire was composed of would now also demand independence. So you might be able to make the Bosnian Serbs happy, but then that would lead all of the other nations that were sort of conquered and part of the Austrian Empire to also demand independence. And then there would be no Austrian Empire. Austria-Hungary would disintegrate into bunches of little independent countries. And the Habsburgs weren't about to let that happen. So they refused to allow Bosnia to detach from Austria-Hungary and attach itself to Serbia. That, of course, just fired up the nationalism of the Serbs living in Bosnia, and frankly, it fired up the nationalism of Serbs living in Serbia. Serbia had ambitions to become bigger. Serbia certainly wanted to rule the Serbs living in Bosnia, and they wanted the territory as well. The ambition of the Serbs was to become a nation state that encompassed all the Serb people. So Serbs in Serbia and Serbs in Bosnia were angry about Austria's refusal to let Bosnia detach and attach itself to Serbia. Serb nationalism was fired up by all of this. And so there were a group of Bosnian Serbs who formed an organization called the Black Hand. That wasn't their official name. Their official name was Union or Death, that is, union between Bosnia and Serbia. But they were better known as the Black Hand. They were a Serb nationalist terrorist organization. A Serb nationalist terrorist organization. That is to say, their goal was related to Serb nationalism. Their goal was to force Austria-Hungary to give up Bosnia so that Bosnia could attach to Serbia, so that the Bosnian Serbs could be ruled by other Serbs. Their strategy was terrorism. They were going to commit acts of terrorism against the Austrian or the Austro-Hungarian government. That is, an act of terrorism is an attack on civilians. An act of war is where soldiers are fighting each other. Acts of terrorism are directed against civilians. So the Black Hand was a Serb nationalist terrorist organization. They wanted to use attacks against Austrian civilians, particularly in the Austrian government, to try to intimidate Austria, persuade Austria to give up Bosnia so that the Bosnian Serbs could become part of Serbia, a Serb nationalist terrorist organization. Austria was certainly aware of their presence in Bosnia, but they were a secret organization. They were called the Black Hand because in order to be a member, you had to be suffering from a disease called tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a lung disease, and in that part of the world, it was terminal. You were certain to die of it. One of the signs that you had it was that your extremities, because you weren't getting enough oxygen, your extremities would start to turn black in color because they weren't getting enough oxygen and cells were starting to die. So they recruited only people who were suffering tuberculosis because they would be willing to commit acts that a person who had a life in front of them probably wouldn't be willing to commit. People who were diagnosed with tuberculosis and showing signs of it were going to die, and they were going to die relatively soon. So they would be willing to commit acts. They would be willing to do things that would put them at risk, put their lives at risk, because they were already certain to die anyway. So in order to be a member of this Serb nationalist terrorist organization, you had to have tuberculosis. And one of the things associated with people with tuberculosis was a blackened hand, blackened extremities from the disease. So they were also known as the Black Hand. The Black Hand plotted to assassinate, to murder the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. The Archduke, his name was Franz Ferdinand Habsburg. He was the nephew of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary's name was Franz Joseph. He had ruled Austria-Hungary since 1848. So by that time, he had ruled Austria-Hungary for 66 years. He had outlived his sons, and so his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, was next in line for the throne. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was going to be the next Emperor of Austria-Hungary. In June of 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie made a trip to Bosnia. They made a trip to the largest city in Bosnia, which is called Sarajevo. The purpose was to demonstrate support for the loyal people in Bosnia, not for the Serbs, but for the loyal people who were still loyal to Austria-Hungary. They wanted to demonstrate support for them, but they also wanted to send a message to the Black Hand and to the Bosnian Serb nationalists. We have our eye on you. We know what you're up to, and we have our eye on you. So sending Franz Ferdinand and Sophie to Sarajevo was meant to have that double effect of encouraging the people who were loyal to the Habsburg family, but also sending a message to the Black Hand and the Serb nationalists. We know what you're up to. We have our eye on you. So Franz and Sophie arrived in Sarajevo, and they were to ride in an open car through the town. The Black Hand was determined to murder them, to assassinate them as they drove through the town. So they sent a team of 7 assassins to position themselves along the route that the car would take as Franz and Sophie proceeded through town. They were helped by the fact that the route that they were going to take was actually published in the newspapers. The Austrian government had published the route so that people who were loyal could come out and cheer for Franz and Sophie. But of course, that allowed the Black Hand to know exactly where Franz and Sophie's car was going to pass. And because of that, they were able to station their 7 assassins along the route. All of the assassins were armed with a pistol and a bomb. Now, when you think of a bomb, think of almost like a cartoon bomb, like a little black ball that has a fuse, and you light it and you throw it and it blows up. They were armed with a pistol and a bomb. They were also given a poison. The poison was for them in the event that they got captured, because the Black Hand leadership knew that this was a mission in which they might get captured, and they didn't want any of these young men to give up information about the organization. So their instructions were, if you get captured, you take the cyanide capsule, you swallow it, and that will kill you. So this map shows the positions of the assassins along the parade route. You can see, or not the parade route, but the motorcade route. And you can see that they had plenty of opportunities to get Franz and Sophie. But as Franz and Sophie's car approached the first assassin chickened out. He freaked out. He was sure that people saw what he was doing, and he didn't do anything. He froze up, didn't light his bomb, didn't pull out his pistol. The second assassin actually attempted to get his bomb lit, but having attempted to get his bomb lit, he struggled to get it lit. It was kind of a rainy day, kind of breezy day. He couldn't get the bomb lit, and by the time he did get it lit, the car had passed, so he simply had to snuff out the bomb and move on, because he wasn't going to succeed in bombing the wasn't going to succeed in bombing the car. Um, the next assassin actually was a little bit more attentive to his job, and so he actually did get his bomb lit, and he managed to toss the bomb sort of in the direction of the open car that Franz and Sophie were riding in. Franz, though, saw the bomb coming, and having seen the bomb coming, he actually used an umbrella. You actually saw him saw Sophie carrying an umbrella, grabbed it and sort of batted the bomb away. And the bomb then actually rolled under the car that was behind them and blew up, causing some injuries there. Um, the assassin who had lit the bomb, of course, now swallowed his cyanide capsule and tried to escape by jumping off of this bridge you see here into the river. But he did not succeed. He was actually captured and dragged off to police headquarters. Other assassins also failed along the route. So now, of course, as you can imagine, after the first bomb went off, Franz and Sophie's driver began to drive faster. This caused some of the other assassins to get their timing mixed up. Some of them also, hearing the bomb explode, walked away because, having heard the bomb explode, they assumed Franz Ferdinand had been killed. Others straight up chickened out. The bottom line is, this was not a crack team of assassins. Not very impressive. None of them accomplished. There were 7 of them, all lined up in perfect positions along the route that Franz and Sophie were taking through Sarajevo, and none of them did their job. All of them failed, and Franz and Sophie arrived at Town Hall here unharmed. Franz was scheduled to make a speech there. He was scheduled to make a speech. He made a brief speech. He actually joked with the mayor of Sarajevo, saying something along the lines of, "This is how you greet visitors to your city, you throw bombs at them." But after the speech was over, it was decided that probably Franz and Sophie should return to the railway station and get on board the train and get out of this town, because as much as Franz might be joking about a bomb flying toward his car, who knew how many other plotters there might be? This was probably not a good, safe place for them to stay. So originally, after the speech at Town Hall, Franz and Sophie were supposed to ride to the museum, which was in town, and tour the museum before leaving. But the decision was made to sort of cut off the plan for going to the museum and instead go straight to the railway station, with perhaps a stop at the hospital to visit the people who had been injured when the bomb went off. Somehow, though, this important information was not communicated to Franz and Sophie's driver. And as the motorcade proceeded back along, sort of doubled back along the route that would take them back to the railway station, Franz and Sophie's driver took a right turn, following the route that he was supposed to take in order to go to the museum. Immediately, he realized his mistake, and he turned into an alley in order to make what we call a 3-point turn. Turn here, come here, and go back and follow the rest of the motorcade. But as he made that turn into that alley, he stalled the car right in front of a sort of a coffee house, where a young man named Gavril Princip was having a cup of coffee and a sandwich. Princip had been one of the 7 assassins who had failed to do his job on the day. On that day, he was a Black Hand assassin. He was 19 years old, and after realizing that the entire team had failed in its mission to kill Franz and Sophie, he had walked away utterly depressed, utterly dejected at his own personal failure and at the team's failure. He was considering taking the cyanide capsule, although no one was threatening to arrest him. He was considering taking the cyanide capsule and committing suicide. But he had chosen to go into this cafe, have a cup of espresso, have a sandwich, and sort of think it all over. What was astonishing was he had just finished his sandwich, he had gotten up, he was walking out of the cafe, when all of a sudden, there was Franz and Sophie right in front of him. The car pulled up right in front of him with Franz and Sophie in it. Princip pulled out his pistol, fired 2 shots. One of them struck Franz in the neck, the other one struck Sophie in the abdomen before Princip was wrestled to the ground. He was never able to swallow his cyanide capsule. So he was captured. He eventually died in a prison of tuberculosis. But Franz and Sophie were mortally wounded. They were dead within hours. And so what at least began as a fully botched assassination attempt turned into a successful assassination. And the Black Hand ended up getting their targets. Both Franz Ferdinand Habsburg, the man who would be the Emperor of Austria, and his wife Sophie were killed. As you can imagine, the response in Austria-Hungary was one of shock and sorrow and rage. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, whom I mentioned had ruled Austria-Hungary for 60 years by that time, 60 plus years by that time, was convinced that the government of Serbia was behind the act. He certainly knew of the Black Hand. He knew that the Black Hand was involved as well, and that these assassins were Black Hand assassins. They were able to determine that because some of the assassins had been captured and had been questioned. In some cases, they had swallowed their cyanide capsules and it hadn't worked, it hadn't killed them. So upon questioning, they had revealed that the assassination was an act of the Black Hand. So he knew that the Black Hand was in on it, but he was also convinced that the government of Serbia was in on it as well. In fact, he believed that the entire thing had been directed by the government of Serbia, because Serbia stood to benefit. If Bosnia detached from Austria-Hungary, attached to Serbia, Serbia would gain territory and would become a stronger country. So he was convinced that the Serb government was behind it. He had no evidence of that. And there is to this day no evidence that the civilian leadership of Serbia was behind the assassination. There is evidence that there were figures in the Serb army, part of the Serb army intelligence or spying division, that were supporting the Black Hand and encouraging this sort of behavior. But there is no evidence that the Serbian civilian government was behind this. They probably cheered it on, but they had not played any role. There's no evidence, even today, more than 100 years later, that they'd played any role. However, Franz Joseph was convinced that Serbia, the government, the country, was behind it. And so he issued what's called an ultimatum. An ultimatum is it's essentially a threat. It's a demand. It's a demand that is followed by the words "or else." You do this or else. Your parents might issue an ultimatum to you: clean up your room or else, do your homework or else. And there's a threat of some sort of punishment. The threat in Franz Josef's case to Serbia was war. I mean, Austria-Hungary was a huge empire with a huge army. Serbia was a relatively small country with a relatively small army. So the threat of war was the threat that backed up Franz Josef's ultimatum. Here are the highlights. He demanded that the government of Serbia suppress the Black Hand, do everything that it could to stop the Black Hand's operations. He was convinced that the government of Serbia was assisting the Black Hand. He said, now you must stop doing that, and you must do everything you can to crush them, or help us crush them. He demanded that the Serbian government prohibit any sort of anti-Austrian demonstrations or protests. He argued that whenever you allow your people to get all stirred up about Bosnia and start saying nasty things about Austria and the fact that we won't give Bosnia its independence, bad things happen. You stir up people like the Black Hand. So I want you to suppress freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We want you to stop your people from saying bad things about Austria. And finally, he demanded that Serbia concede territory to Austria, give up some of its territory to Austria. the amount of territory he was demanding was roughly 1/3 of all of Serbia's territory. So this is considered a demand of the first two demands were sort of reasonable demands that you could expect that the Serbian government might be willing to fulfill, particularly the first one. This third one, though, the idea that Serbia would give up 1/3 of its territory and have more Serbs living under Austrian control, there's no way Serbia was going to agree to that. This was meant to humiliate Serbia or provoke them to fight war. And it's probably the latter. Probably Franz Josef wanted to go to war with Serbia because then he expected to crush them completely, and he felt that would sort of settle the entire issue. If you completely wiped out Serbia, that would demoralize the Bosnian Serbs. They would realize there was no future becoming part of Serbia, and he wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. So probably he included this as a way of forcing the Serbs to say no, which then would lead to war, and he anticipated crushing the Serbs. What he didn't count on was for the Serbs to say yes to the first two parts of the ultimatum, and then ask for time to consider the third. Because in the meantime, the Serbs were out looking for help. At that time, there was a sentiment in Europe called pan-Slavism. The Serbs were a nation of people who were tied to several other nations of people that all shared a common root language called Slavic. All of these nations of people who you can see here, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Russians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, these are all people whose languages are tied back to a single language called Slavic. So they have a sort of a shared heritage. And even though each one is a unique nation with its own language and its own customs and its own history, even though they're a unique nation, they share this common heritage of their Slavic ancestry. At this time in Europe, there was a sense growing that was called Pan-Slavism. It was the idea that all Slavic nations should sort of stick together, support each other, fight for each other, back each other up. And the largest of all the Slavic nations was the Russians. And so they were sort of the leaders of this pan-Slavic movement. And so when Serbia was confronted with this ultimatum, this demand, this threat from Austria-Hungary, the Serbs turned to the Russians and said, in the event that we end up at war with Austria-Hungary, can we count on Russia's support? Will Russia declare war on Austria-Hungary and fight Austria-Hungary alongside us? Well, the Russians, led by Tsar Nicholas II, they were pretty passionate about Pan-Slavism. They were pretty passionate believers that all Slavic nations should stand up for each other and fight for each other. And as the largest Slavic nation, they felt a particular responsibility to sort of be the leader, the big brother, to all the other smaller Slavic nations. And so when Tsar Nicholas was presented with this request from the Serbs, a smaller Slavic nation, to stand up for them, to help them fight Austria-Hungary, Tsar Nicholas agreed. Now, had he not agreed, this war might not have happened. Had he not agreed, the Serbs might have just had to say, oh boy, well, we can't take on Austria-Hungary by ourselves. I guess we're just going to have to give in and accept this loss of territory. That might have prevented the war, but that's not what happened. Tsar Nicholas, out of the spirit of Pan-Slavism, that all the Slavic people should stand up for each other and that Russia would lead the way, his decision to go by Pan-Slavism, his decision to tell the Serbs, yes, you will have our support in a war against Austria-Hungary, emboldened the Serbs and gave them the courage to say to Austria-Hungary, no, we will accept and go along with the first two provisions of your ultimatum, but we cannot go along with the third. So now the ball was in Austria-Hungary's court. Austria-Hungary seemed enthusiastic about going to war with Serbia, but now war with Serbia would mean war with Russia as well. Could Austria-Hungary manage that? Maybe, but only if they were certain of support from some of their big brother countries, like Germany. The question is, would Germany stand up with Austria-Hungary the way that Russia had stood up with Serbia? That, in turn, relied on the attitude of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany. And that will be the focus of our next lesson. So I look forward to teaching you that lesson. But until then, I hope you stay healthy. I hope you stay safe. Take good care of yourselves. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.